to do is put the discussion of illicit financial flows in the context of financial flows generally, because after all, financial flows are part and parcel of the international trade investment community. There's all kinds of financial flows that are happening all the time, and that would happen even if there were zero illicit flows. So how do these happen? They happen in the coming out of the trade level of imbalances between imports and exports. So money is changing hands to balance out those accounts. They happen in investment accounts related to financial flows in and out of countries, of funds seeking high returns in one place or another, either in government debt or in private investment. They happen through foreign direct investment. Funds are coming into the lower income countries that we're mostly concerned with today, and the funds can flow in for investment, and then eventually some of the profits of those investments may flow out. But in the meantime, there are some benefits provided to the countries that are getting those investment flows. Vary, of course, depending on what kind of investments we are talking about. In both 1 and 2, both the investment and the trade flows, both of those kinds of flows, issues of tax policy, corporate tax policy, and what we call tax avoidance, tax minimization activities go on. And I gather the other 2 panelists are going to be particularly focusing on that question. There is obviously going to be some gaming here in which firms are recording their profits and sales in as much as they can in districts that have low taxes. We might be critical of many of those activities, but some of them are completely legal, and so one question has to do, of course, for policy, should certain things which are now legal be made illegal, right? So the basic point is there often can be very big outflows from a country simply because the country's opportunities are weak relative to the options around the world. And so that can both be reflected in FDI decisions and other kinds of financial decisions that people are making. So how is it when did these flows become illicit flows? Well, one of the things that happens is that a country actually has weak investment opportunities, poor institutions, not very much to invest in, but it doesn't like it that so much money is flowing out of the country. So it imposes some constraints on the export of capital. So it might have exchange controls. It might have a currency that isn't convertible. It might be trying to levy relatively high taxes, partly because it doesn't have a big tax base, so that the tax rates are relatively high. That the attempts of investors or ordinary people to avoid these constraints lead to illicit flows. So if you're trying to hide the fact that you want to get your currency, your money out of the country because there aren't very many good opportunities there, and the flows become illicit because the countries are imposing constraints on you. Those might be perfectly well justified constraints, but they are seen as constraints by the investors. I've been very interested in the country-level reports that Global Financial Integrity has been doing. I took a look at a couple of them yesterday when I was thinking about my remarks. Very interesting study on China, another very interesting study on Mexico, and looked at some others that look interesting. And I hear there's one in the Philippines that's about to come out. So one of the dramatic pieces of information in the data on China and in the overall report is China looks like it's just out of this world in terms of illicit financial flows compared to any other country. Way high, and of course that's partly just a big country, but so what's going on there? Well, you don't usually think of, as China as the location of the opium trade or something. I mean, it's more like importing maybe, but it's not like it's a big drug center or big organized crime center. There is organized crime, but it's much more dominant in other places. Well, it seems to be a lot of it is misinvoicing, mispricing of goods. Now, I don't know quite how you actually count that. If you count the whole volume of the trade that's over invoiced or under invoiced, it's going to look like a big number. But of course, if nobody was doing any over invoicing or invoicing, there'd be a lot of trade involving China, and so the actual kind of, if you actually ask me what's the marginal difference between what would have happened if there wasn't invoicing, over invoicing, under invoicing, and what would happen otherwise, well, it wouldn't be the whole volume of the trade. But why is this happening? Well, I don't know enough about China, some of you probably do, but certainly part of it is the lack of convertibility of the currency. Part of it may be capital controls on how easy it is to get capital out of the country. I think that is true. I've certainly read things about people going to gamble and using gambling trips as ways to get money out of the country for other opportunities. So it's a kind of a nice example, I think, of a set of constraints on the system that then produce big pressures for people to get around those rules by taking the money out of the country. So that's suggesting, if we're thinking about policy, that the real problem is not it's treating the symptom without the disease. If you're just simply trying to stop people from over invoicing or under invoicing, rather than asking what is it in the underlying situation that has kind of been producing this result. I also thought it was interesting. So you would ordinarily think, as at least coming at this from an economics background, that if you have trade is freer and less restricted, well, that ought to mean that there might be some bad results on that, but they wouldn't be the results that have to do with illicit financial flows. But the study on Mexico made the interesting point that the growth of NAFTA, which is after all a free trade agreement between U.S., Mexico, and Canada, had actually increased the volume of misinvoiced goods. Well, why was that? Well, once again, it's not clear, but you could at least guess that maybe it's partly because, first of all, there's a bigger volume of trade, right? So there are more transactions in which you can hide things. But why would you want to hide things? Well, this seems like a rather awkward way to be hiding your drug money, which is, of course, an issue in Mexico. But maybe that's part of it, or maybe Mexico has some other kinds of capital controls that make it that give people an incentive to try to get money out of the country in this surreptitious way rather than legally. So what really needs to be done is to ask, what is it that's producing this incentive to take account of or take advantage of these bigger opportunities. Similarly, you can imagine if there are restrictions on capital imports, export controls that will lead to all kinds of flows going underground. The second thing is that when things cross borders as opposed to being domestic stuff, special rules may be imposed at the border. All right, so the obvious one is customs. People want to avoid having to pay customs or some other kind of taxes on crossing the border, so you want to try to avoid customs duties and by not saying mispricing as miscategorizing goods. Say we're just importing something that has a low tariff on it, when really we're importing something that has a very high tariff on it, or similarly for some kind of export constraints. And that can also take the form of outright smuggling. All right, so one piece of the illicit flows, at least that you'd like to measure, are as pure smuggling. Trade which doesn't enter into the national accounts directly. Maybe you indirectly have figured out some clever ways to figure it out, but at the border it's not noticed. It's actually, people actually sneaking around over the mountains, or they're paying off the, probably a more common thing, they're just paying off the customs inspectors to just like look the other way while the trucks roll by. Some of this stuff will, of course, get actually into the national accounts, just as I was saying, mischaracterized as what it is in return for the payment of bribes. So the problem there is basically taxes being avoided, maybe quality controls being avoided in one form or another. So, similarly, when investment comes in across borders, foreign direct investment of one kind or another, there may be special either constraints making it prohibiting certain kinds of FDI from coming in which case you would like to sneak it around and pretend it's something else, or, as in China, financial incentives to external foreign investors that are stronger than any benefits given to purely domestic investors. So a good chunk of the illicit flows in China is stuff that's going around in a circle, right? So stuff that comes from China, goes to Hong Kong, goes to the British Virgin Islands, goes to the Bahamas, goes someplace like that, and then comes right back again. And they have pretty good data. Other people have had this too on this round tripping of FDI. Once again, if you talked about what the losses are for the country, it's obviously not the whole volume of the FDI. After all, the FDI is coming back, into the country. It's the wasted funds being spent on the subsidy, corrected by some question. Well, if they didn't have the subsidy, would some of this money actually get invested somewhere else? Like the United States or some other place in Asia. What does the investment market look like, and how much are the subsidies actually encouraging extra investment, and how much of it just gives everybody extra profits? Hard empirical questions, but it needs to be recognized. Third, of course, one other source of these illicit transfers is that the goods themselves, the physical goods themselves, are illegal, right? So that in some ways the illicit transfers are the least of it. They may be something that you can measure in some way. But the problem really is that we're talking about drugs, weapons, people, liquor under prohibition, various kinds of goods and services that don't show up in the export-import data for the country unless they're labeled as something else. So, and they may be hidden in over and under invoicing, or in simply funds being laundered out of a country through money center banks to get into the international community. Once again, Mexico, there have been a couple of recent situations in which the U.S. government has gone after first HSBC and then Citi and maybe some others for not having enough constraints on the way in which their banking operations operated inside Mexico. So as I said before, there may be other reasons why people who are otherwise engaged in honest business in Mexico want to sneakily get their funds out, but surely a chunk of it is the drug trade, which is a big business in Mexico, and people might want to get their profits out somewhere else. So that's important, but it's important to think that or to ask the question: to what extent does the fact that you can engage in this illicit laundering of the resources act as something that increases the cost of engaging in this international business, and therefore acts as a deterrent to that international business? Because that's what you're really concerned about is the illicit activity that's going on. So what are the costs of this? I mean, there's the direct loss of funds to Mexico that are not collected in taxes or not invested locally, that maybe are going abroad where they might have otherwise been invested locally. But of course, there is the other thing that has the obvious indirect cost is the relationship to facilitating the illegal businesses. There's also a kind of, I don't know, ironic cost, which I came across when I was working on corruption in the 80s. In other words, before the fall of the Soviet Union. I was writing a paper with a very distinguished economist here, Michael Montius, who studied the Soviet economy. And this didn't have to do with trade, but it had to do with the fact that illegal businesses don't show up in the GDP. So we presented our paper on corruption in Soviet-style economies to a group of economists who were trying to estimate the size of the Soviet Union's GDP. And they were very worried that they had too small a number. They wanted a big number to kind of justify lots of, I guess, research help, to study the Soviet Union. But they were really worried that they had underestimated the size of the economy because they hadn't measured the vodka market sufficiently. Right? That was too small a number of things. So they were very interested in the size of the illegal business because it was it meant that they had the official numbers were not big enough. I mean, it's a kind of weird way of thinking about it, right? So we don't usually, but it points out that usual GDP figures, we don't make judgments, about all that fast food everybody's eating. That's really terrible. So we only want to count it like as half. Right? We count it all in it. But here we're talking about an important part of an economy that's not getting listed, but it's also you might want to put a negative sign on it in some countries. Fourth, of course, is the thing that I think people think about initially, and I think it is very important as a part of the reason for our source of illegal flows, and that's corrupt people inside of a country, high-level corrupt people inside a country, who can't spend those funds in the country because otherwise it would be noticed that they were too corrupt, or they don't want to. They want to have an apartment in Paris. They don't want an apartment in, somewhere where they're living. So they are taking the money out, and it has to be done in an illicit way because if they tried to do it in a legal way, it would be noticed. So it's a symbol, once again, of the underlying corruption that's there, and partly indicating that it's a problem, but also to the extent it can be controlled, a constraint on or something that reduces the incentive to be corrupt. Of course, it's going to do that much more in a country that's very poor, where you probably don't want to live anyway, right? I mean, so it's because obviously you can spend your ill-gotten gains in all sorts of ways that involve simply domestic spending. There's an African country where somebody built a huge cathedral, and massive cathedral. He didn't have to go. He didn't spend it. Maybe he did too. But that money was spent inside the country. Okay. So the problem, I think, is that what we've got is a risk of from the lack of coordinated efforts at the international level, which I gather to some extent. Global Financial Integrity and the other people involved in this conference are, particularly concerned about. You're concerned about sort of races to the bottom in regulation of taxes, financial regulation, and in required disclosure to certain kinds of self-defeating go-it-alone strategies, and to an increasing move of separating physical economic activities from where the bank accounts are located. And I don't, to some extent the kind of policy proposals are sort of specific to the individual countries or the individual kinds of cross-border flows that we're talking about, so I don't have a neat conclusion here. But the sort of basic lesson is that the focus in policy should be on what is the harm that's being caused, the net harm that's being caused by the illicit flows, right? Not just the total volume of the flows, but the kind of marginal harm of the flows in terms of lost taxes, in terms of the facilitation of international illegal trade, in terms of the reduction in investment flows, or the reduction in the benefits of the investment flows to the local people, suggests, as I have said to Ray Baker before, not putting a lot of emphasis on Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates if you're interested in the social costs of the illicit transfer of funds. I think it's a good thing if a lot of money flows out of a very wealthy country with very few people in it, illicitly or illicitly, right? They're getting to be part of the global financial systems. But that's not to say that there aren't other places where it's very important, and your more recent list includes quite a number of very important countries besides China, where this looks like a serious problem. But I'm an old microeconomist, and I just think you need to pull the aggregate numbers apart to find out what it is that's going on. Because, as I say, there could be plenty of white elephants in bad way, inefficient ways of spending money inside of countries, as well as a result of cross-border stuff. So it seems to me that institutions like the World Bank or the IMF ought to be both doing a good job at trying to just document what these restrictions are, and how the restrictions that the countries are imposing on the flow of funds and of capital and of trade, and trying to understand the extent to which they're being enforced or not. You may have things that the country is able to justify on some domestic political and economic reasons, but that because they're not being enforced, because they show up in your data as high levels of illicit flows, suggests that nothing is being gained, that people are just pretending something's happening when it's not, and that this should be a role of international communities to try to point that out, to measure it, to help countries deal with those problems. So I hope that is the direction in which these countries could go. Institutions could go. I'd always thought that the World Bank could do a much better job at benchmarking the costs of different kinds of projects, to facilitate their relationship to the countries that are borrowing either from them or now more than ever from the international center. So thank you very much.